The December wind sliced through the city streets like a sharpened blade. Snow that had looked magical just an hour earlier had turned cruel and relentless. It stung the skin, clawed through coats, and turned every breath into a cloud of frost. James Thompson pulled his black overcoat tighter around himself as he walked through the park. His mind was still grinding through numbers, contracts, projections. The board meeting had dragged on 2 hours longer than planned, and the arguments still echoed in his head. At 38 years old, James had built Thompson Technologies from nothing. A startup in a cramped office had grown into a multi-million-dollar company. Investors respected him. Competitors feared him. Financial magazines called him brilliant. But success had taken its payment. 3 years ago, his marriage had ended. His ex-wife had moved to California with their daughter Olivia. Now he only saw her during holidays and summer breaks. His penthouse apartment was pristine, silent, and far too big for one person. Achievement filled his calendar. Loneliness filled everything else. He had chosen to walk home tonight. His driver had called in sick, and James decided he would rather walk 15 blocks through the cold than wait for another car service. The shortcut through Henderson Park should have been cheerful. Christmas lights hung across the bare branches, glowing softly through the falling snow. But instead of warmth, they only reminded him of something missing. The holidays had become something he endured rather than celebrated. And then he heard it. "Excuse me, sir." James turned. A small boy stood near a snow-covered bench, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His tan jacket was far too thin for the weather. Beneath it was a red sweater that looked worn at the sleeves. His jeans were frayed at the knees. Snow clung to his damp brown hair. His cheeks were red from the cold, but it was his eyes that stopped James. Frightened, and trying so hard to stay brave. "Yes?" James said carefully, stepping closer while scanning the park for an adult. "Sir, my baby sister is freezing." The boy's voice cracked, the bravery slipping just a little. "I don't know what to do." That was when James saw the bundle in the boy's arms. A baby, wrapped in a thin blanket that did nothing against the cold. The infant's face was red and tight with distress. Her cries were weak, fading, and something in James's instincts screamed that fading cries were not a good sign. "How long have you been out here?" he asked quickly. "I don't know," the boy whispered. James stepped closer. "Where are your parents?" The boy's lips trembled. "Mom left us here. She said she'd be right back." He looked down at the baby in his arms. That was a long time ago. Before it got dark. For a moment the world seemed to pause. A park bench. A freezing night. 2 children abandoned in the snow. You hear stories like this sometimes and think they must be exaggerated. That someone would surely step in. That some adult would notice. But reality can be painfully quiet sometimes. And if James hadn't taken that shortcut, well, that thought alone is enough to send a chill deeper than the winter wind. "I tried to keep Sarah warm," the boy continued, his voice shaking now. "But she won't stop crying. And now she's getting quiet." His eyes lifted toward James. "Mom said it's bad when babies get quiet." James was already pulling off his coat. "You're right," he said softly. "That is bad." He wrapped the expensive cashmere coat around both children. It swallowed them in warmth. "What's your name?" "Timothy?" "Everyone calls me Tim." "Okay, Tim. My name is James." James crouched slightly so the boy could see his face clearly. "We need to get you and Sarah somewhere warm right now. Will you come with me?" Tim hesitated. You could almost see the battle happening inside that small head. Every child is taught the same rule. Don't talk to strangers. But rules become complicated when your baby sister is freezing in your arms. "I promise I'm safe," James said gently. "I have a daughter too. And if she were in trouble, I would hope someone would help her." He extended a hand. "Let me help you." A tear slipped down Tim's cheek. He nodded. James carefully lifted the baby from the boy's arms. Her skin felt frighteningly cold. His heart started racing. The nearest hospital was 10 blocks away. His apartment was 6. He made the decision instantly. "We're going to my home first," he said firmly. "We'll warm you up and call for medical help." Tim nodded quickly. They started moving through the snow. James barely noticed the cold anymore. His polished shoes slipped across patches of ice. His suit jacket did nothing against the wind. But none of that mattered. Tim walked beside him, clutching the sleeve of James's shirt like a lifeline. "How long were you waiting?" James asked as they hurried. "I don't know," Tim murmured. "Mom said she needed to run an errand. She said 10 minutes. The boy swallowed. But then it started snowing harder, and it got dark. A pause. Did she forget about us? James felt a tight knot in his chest. I don't know, he answered honestly. And in that moment you realize something heartbreaking. Children will search for reasons to forgive the people who hurt them, even when those people disappear, even when the truth is standing right in front of them like a freezing winter night. But right now, James said firmly, we're just going to focus on getting you warm. Snow swirled around them as they pushed through the streets. Inside James's arms, Sarah's cries had faded to weak little sounds. Too quiet. Way too quiet. And James knew they had very little time left. The lobby doors of his apartment building swung open, spilling warm light across the marble floor. Marcus, the doorman, blinked in shock. Mr. Thompson, is everything all right? James didn't slow down. Call Dr. Richardson, he said quickly. Tell him it's an emergency. I need him at my apartment immediately. Marcus straightened instantly. Yes, sir. And call the police non-emergency line, James added. Tell them I found 2 abandoned children in Henderson Park. Tim tightened his grip on James's sleeve as they stepped into the elevator. Inside James's arms, the baby barely moved. James looked down at her tiny face. Stay with me, he whispered softly. Stay with me, little one. And right then, somewhere deep inside him, something long buried began to wake up again. A protective instinct he thought had disappeared years ago. The instinct of a father. And the truth is, once that instinct wakes up, it doesn't go back to sleep easily. The elevator doors opened into a penthouse that had always been immaculate, quiet, almost museum-like. Tonight, for the first time in years, the silence shattered the moment James rushed inside with 2 freezing children in his arms. Tim, stay close to me, he said quickly. The warmth inside the apartment hit them instantly. But the danger wasn't over. Hypothermia could turn deadly even after someone got indoors. James laid the baby carefully on the couch, still wrapped inside his coat. Her tiny body looked far too still for a child that small. Tim, he said gently but firmly, I need your help. The boy stepped forward immediately, eyes wide. Can you run into that room? James pointed to the hallway. That's my bedroom. Grab every blanket you can find. Tim nodded and ran. James slowly unwrapped the baby. Her lips had a faint bluish tint. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. His heart pounded hard against his ribs. He rubbed her tiny hands gently, trying to encourage circulation. Come on, Sarah, he whispered. Stay with us. Moments later, Tim returned, arms overloaded with blankets, almost tripping under the pile. Together, they built a soft nest of warmth on the couch. James turned the thermostat higher. He rushed to the kitchen and filled the kettle to prepare warm water bottles. Then he checked the baby's breathing again, timing each fragile inhale with his phone. Those minutes felt longer than any board meeting he had ever endured. And honestly, if you've ever held a child who is too quiet when they shouldn't be, you understand that strange fear. It's a silence that presses against your chest and makes every second feel heavier. 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. James opened the door to Dr. Richardson, his longtime physician, carrying a medical bag. Behind him stood 2 police officers. Where is she? The doctor asked immediately. In the living room. Dr. Richardson moved quickly, kneeling beside the couch and beginning his examination. James led Tim into the kitchen. The boy's hands trembled as James wrapped them around a mug of hot chocolate. You did everything right tonight, James said gently. Tim looked up at him. I did? You kept your sister warm as best you could. And when things got scary, you asked for help. A pause. That's brave. Tim stared down at the mug. Is Sarah going to be okay? James glanced toward the living room. The doctor is taking care of her. He lowered his voice. She's in good hands. One of the officers, a woman with calm eyes and a professional tone, pulled out a chair. I'm Detective Chen, she said. Tim, can you tell me what happened today? Tim's story came slowly. Broken pieces of a difficult life. Their mother's name was Diane. She had struggled with addiction for years. Recently, she had tried to get clean, and for 6 months things had been better. But lately, something had changed again. That afternoon, she had taken them to the park. She told Tim she needed to run an errand. 10 minutes, she had said. But she never came back. She took her purse and phone, Tim said quietly. Everything. He looked down. I waited because she said to stay on the bench. The detective nodded slowly. And how long were you there? I don't know. Tim swallowed hard. It got dark. He looked toward the living room where the doctor was working. And Sarah started crying because she was cold. He rubbed his eyes. I tried to hold her close, but she kept getting colder. For a moment, the kitchen was silent. And this is the moment when you realize how much responsibility a child sometimes carries without anyone noticing. A 7-year-old boy trying to protect a baby in the middle of winter. That's not bravery children should ever need to learn. You did the right thing, asking for help, Detective Chen said softly. Do you have any other family? Tim shook his head. Just Mom and Grandma. Where does your grandma live? I don't remember. Dr. Richardson finally stepped into the kitchen. The baby has moderate hypothermia, he said calmly. James straightened immediately. But I've stabilized her temperature. She's responding well. Tim's eyes widened. She's okay? She will be, the doctor replied. But she needs to stay at a hospital overnight for observation. He turned to James. You found them just in time. A quiet sentence. But the meaning was heavy. Another hour in that cold could have ended very differently. And Tim? James asked. Dr. Richardson gave a reassuring nod. Mild frostbite on his fingers. Exhaustion. But nothing permanent. He looked at the boy with a faint smile. You're a tough kid. The next few hours passed in a blur. An ambulance arrived. Sarah was carefully placed into a warming unit for transport. Tim immediately grabbed James's hand. I'm not leaving her, he said. James squeezed gently. You won't have to. He turned toward the officers. I'll go with them. Detective Chen nodded. We'll need statements from both of you anyway. At the hospital pediatric ward, doctors examined the children more thoroughly. James sat beside Tim in the waiting room. He had already called his assistant Maria, clearing his entire schedule for the next day. He had called his lawyer to understand the legal complications that might follow. He had even texted his ex-wife to warn her that Olivia's weekend visit might need to be postponed. But none of those thoughts mattered right now. Tim sat beside him wearing oversized hospital scrubs, still wrapped in James's coat. He looked very small in the bright hospital lights. Mr. James? Tim whispered. You can just call me James. The boy nodded slowly. James, what's going to happen to us? That question hung in the air. James knew the system well enough. Foster care, temporary placements, group homes, and far too often, siblings separated. He thought about his empty penthouse. Then he looked at the boy beside him. I don't know yet, James said honestly. But I promise you something. Tim looked up. I will make sure you and Sarah stay together. The boy's eyes filled with quiet hope. A little later, Detective Chen returned with news. They had found Diane. She had been arrested several blocks away attempting to buy drugs. She was disoriented, confused, barely remembered leaving her children in the park. She was now in custody, facing serious charges. Detective Chen folded her hands. Child Services will need to place the children. She paused. But the system is overwhelmed right now, especially this time of year. James leaned forward. What if I took them? The room went silent. Detective Chen looked at him carefully. I'm serious. You're a single man, she replied. And you barely know these children. I have a daughter, James said. That's not the same. Maybe not, James admitted. But they trust me. They're comfortable with me. He glanced at Tim. And they've already been through enough tonight. He took a slow breath. I'm not asking permanently. Just temporarily. I have the space. The resources. I can hire help. Tim's eyes were fixed on him now. Hope flickering carefully. You could see it in that small face. The silent question every abandoned child eventually asks. Will this person stay? Or will they disappear too? Detective Chen sighed. I'll make some calls. 4 long hours passed. Phone calls. Emergency paperwork. A late-night home inspection from a social worker. James calling in favors he didn't even realize he still had. Finally, at 3 a.m, everything was approved. James drove home slowly through quiet streets. In the back seat, Sarah slept inside a hospital-issued car seat. Tim sat beside her, his hand resting gently on the carrier. James glanced at them through the rearview mirror. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been a quarterly earnings report. Now he was responsible for 2 children who had almost frozen to death. Life can turn on a single moment, one shortcut through a park, one small voice asking for help, and suddenly the entire direction of your life changes. James looked at the sleeping children again, and deep down he knew something. This was only the beginning. Waiting for your command. Continue to write Part 3. The city was still quiet when James pulled his car into the underground garage of his building. Snow clung to the windshield and the streets were almost empty. the kind of silence that only exists in the early hours before dawn. In the back seat, Tim had fallen asleep beside the baby carrier. One small hand rested protectively on the edge of Sarah's seat, as if even in sleep he was guarding her. James turned off the engine and looked at them for a long moment. 24 hours ago, he had been a CEO walking through the park thinking about profit margins and boardroom strategy. Now he was responsible for 2 children whose lives had almost ended on a freezing bench. Life can pivot so suddenly it almost feels unreal. But reality was sitting right behind him. He carefully carried Sarah upstairs first, then gently woke Tim. "We're home," James said quietly. The boy blinked sleep from his eyes and followed him inside. For years the penthouse had been spotless, organized, quiet to the point of loneliness. Tonight it instantly felt different. James turned one of the guest rooms into a bedroom for Tim, piling soft blankets onto the bed. His home office became a temporary nursery for Sarah. A crib would have to wait until morning, so he arranged pillows carefully inside a portable bassinet the hospital had sent with them. Tim stood nearby, watching everything closely. "Is she okay?" he asked again. James warmed a bottle and carefully fed the baby. Sarah drank slowly at first, then with surprising strength. Her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. "She's going to be okay," James said. Tim exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. "You saved her tonight," James added. The boy looked confused. "I just asked for help." "That's exactly why," Tim nodded quietly. You could see the exhaustion in his eyes now that the danger had passed. Children can be incredibly brave in crisis, but once the storm fades, the weight of everything finally lands. James guided him toward the bed. "You need sleep. Will you still be here in the morning?" Tim asked softly. James didn't hesitate. Only one word. But sometimes one word is enough to build the beginning of trust. Tim finally climbed into bed and fell asleep almost instantly. James returned to the living room and sank into the couch. The clock read 5 in the morning. His mind was racing too fast to rest. What had he just done? He had essentially become a foster parent overnight. An infant. A traumatized 7-year-old. He hadn't changed a diaper in 8 years. He had a company to run, investors expecting results, meetings already scheduled weeks in advance. But when he pictured that park bench again, when he remembered Sarah's cold skin and Tim's frightened voice, the decision suddenly felt obvious. These children needed someone, and somehow that someone had become him. The phone rang at 7 in the morning. James answered groggily. "Please tell me the news stories I'm seeing are not real," Maria said immediately. His assistant sounded both shocked and amused. "What news stories?" "James," she said. "There are photos all over social media of you carrying 2 kids into a hospital last night." Apparently someone at the hospital had posted the story online. Within hours it had spread everywhere. The headlines were dramatic. Tech CEO rescues freezing children. Midnight hero saves abandoned baby. Maria continued. The public relations team is losing their minds trying to figure out how to respond. James rubbed his temples. "Tell them no comment. No interviews. No publicity." He sighed. "This wasn't a business move." "I know," Maria said gently. "And for what it's worth, everyone at the office is proud of you." She paused. "I already cleared your schedule for the week." James blinked. "You did? You have 2 kids now," she said. "Go be a dad." Over the next few days, James entered a world he hadn't expected to return to. Parenting. He hired a nanny named Mrs. Patel, a calm and experienced woman who had raised 5 children of her own. She handled Sarah with effortless skill. Bottles, baths, diapers. The rhythm of caring for a baby slowly returned to James's memory. Tim began seeing a child therapist who specialized in trauma. At night, he sometimes woke from nightmares about the cold. James would sit beside the bed until the boy fell asleep again. He also discovered something surprising. Tim was incredibly bright. The boy devoured books, asked endless questions about science, and could already read at a 5th-grade level. One evening they sat together on the living room floor, building a blanket fort. Sarah slept peacefully nearby in her carrier. Tim looked at James suddenly. "What about our mom?" James had been expecting the question. Detective Chen had been updating him regularly. Diane was still in custody. She had admitted to relapsing into addiction after almost 6 months of sobriety. She was now facing serious charges related to child endangerment. James chose his words carefully. "Your mom is sick," he said gently. "Not sick like the flu." He tapped his head softly. "Sick in her mind because of something called addiction." Tim listened closely. It makes people make bad choices even when they love their children very much. The boy stared down at the floor. So we can't go home? Not right now. A long pause filled the room. Maybe not for a long time. Tim nodded slowly. But then James placed a hand on his shoulder. And I need you to understand something important. The boy looked up. None of this is your fault. Not your mom's illness. Not what happened in the park. You're a kid, Tim. Your job is to be a kid. The adults are supposed to take care of you. Silence filled the blanket fort. Finally, Tim spoke. I'm glad you found us. He looked up with a small smile. I'm glad you weren't a bad stranger. And if that sentence doesn't hit you right in the heart, nothing will. Because sometimes the greatest compliment a child can give is simply believing you are safe. 3 weeks later, James sat in family court. The courtroom was quiet as the judge reviewed the case. Diane had been sentenced to a rehabilitation program and would remain incarcerated for at least 1 year. Even after that, she would need to prove sobriety before supervised visits could begin. The judge looked at James over her glasses. Mr. Thompson. Yes, Your Honor. You have been caring for Timothy and Sarah for 3 weeks. She glanced at a report. Child Services reports both children are thriving. She continued reading. Sarah has recovered fully from the hypothermia. Timothy has enrolled in school and attends therapy regularly. James nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge leaned back slightly. I am prepared to grant you temporary foster custody. There would be monthly reviews, home inspections, and oversight from Child Services. If at any time the placement is deemed unsuitable, the children will be relocated. I understand, James said. The judge studied him for a moment. One question remains. She folded her hands. You are a successful CEO, with enormous responsibilities. You had no obligation to take these children in. She raised an eyebrow slightly. So tell me, why are you doing this? James glanced behind him. Mrs. Patel sat in the gallery holding Sarah. Tim sat beside her, swinging his feet nervously. When their eyes met, the boy gave him a small, hopeful smile. James turned back toward the judge. When I found them that night, he said slowly, they were cold, scared, and alone. He paused. Helping them at first was simply the right thing to do. But during these past weeks, something changed. He looked down for a moment. They didn't just need help. They needed a home. And somewhere along the way, he smiled faintly, they became part of mine. The judge watched him carefully. Then she gave a small approving nod. Temporary foster custody is granted. And just like that, a man who had once lived alone in a silent penthouse had officially become responsible for 2 small lives. But the truth is, the story was far from over. Because sometimes the families we never planned for become the ones that change everything. And the most unexpected chapter of James Thompson's life had only just begun. 6 months passed. Life inside James Thompson's penthouse looked nothing like it once had. The quiet marble floors were now scattered with toy cars, stuffed animals, and half-built block towers. Children's books filled the shelves where business journals once sat. The once spotless living room now carried the warm chaos of a real home. And somehow, James wouldn't have changed a single thing. Tim had settled into school and quickly amazed his teachers. His curiosity seemed endless. Every night he had a new question about space, science, or how something worked. Sarah had grown stronger every week. Her laugh filled the apartment with a bright sound that James had never realized his home had been missing. And then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Olivia arrived for her holiday visit. James had been nervous all week. His daughter was 11 now. Smart, observant, and used to having her father all to herself during visits. Suddenly, she was walking into a home with 2 new children she had never met. He wasn't sure how she would react. The elevator doors opened. Olivia stepped inside the apartment, her suitcase rolling behind her. She looked around the living room, filled with toys. Then she saw Tim sitting on the floor, building a small rocket model, and Sarah sitting nearby, stacking colorful blocks. Olivia blinked. James braced himself. But Olivia's face suddenly lit up. They're adorable. Before James could say anything else, she had already rushed over and picked up Sarah, who giggled happily. Tim looked up shyly. I'm Tim. Olivia smiled. I'm Olivia. I think we're siblings now. Within minutes, the apartment filled with laughter. Olivia helped Tim finish the rocket model. Sarah tried repeatedly to knock it over while giggling. James stood in the kitchen doorway watching them. Something warm settled quietly in his chest. For the first time in years, the word family felt real again. And sometimes life surprises you like that. You spend years chasing success, thinking fulfillment lives somewhere in your career or your achievements. Then suddenly you're standing in your living room watching three kids laugh together and realizing the definition of success just changed completely. But the future still held one more difficult moment. Nearly a year after that freezing night in the park, James sat in a quiet meeting room inside the Family Services building. Across from him sat Diane. She looked different now. Thinner, healthier, but also tired in a way that ran deeper than physical exhaustion. Months of rehabilitation had helped her regain clarity. She was sober now and working hard to rebuild her life. But the truth she had come to understand was painful. She wasn't ready to be the mother her children needed. A social worker sat nearby as part of the required supervision. Diane's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I've had a lot of time to think." Her voice cracked. "I love my children more than anything." She looked down at the table. "But love doesn't always mean you're strong enough." James listened quietly. Diane continued. "They're safe with you." Her eyes filled with tears. "They're happy." She took a deep breath. "So I'm signing the papers." The words hung heavily in the air. Voluntary termination of parental rights. It was one of the hardest decisions a parent could make. "I want you to adopt them," Diane said. "Give them the life I couldn't." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "But promise me something." James leaned forward slightly. "Promise me you'll tell them I love them." "That I tried." Her voice trembled. "That I just wasn't strong enough. But they were always worth everything." James nodded slowly. "I promise is mine, and I will make sure they know who you are." He paused. "Where they came from. They deserve the truth." Diane nodded gratefully. Sometimes love means holding on. Sometimes love means letting go. And that moment was a painful example of the second kind. 2 years after that cold December night, the family returned to court. But this time the atmosphere felt completely different. The courtroom wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was filled with quiet anticipation. Tim, now 9 years old, stood proudly beside James. Sarah, now 2, sat in his arms holding a small stuffed rabbit. The judge reviewed the final paperwork. Then she smiled warmly. "Today we finalize the adoption of Timothy and Sarah." Her voice carried across the courtroom. "With this decision, these children officially become members of the Thompson family." Tim squeezed James's hand. Sarah clapped without fully understanding why everyone looked so happy. The judge raised the gavel. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson." The sound of the gavel echoed softly. Just like that, it was official. That evening, the apartment felt more alive than ever. Toy blocks covered the carpet. Cartoons played softly in the background. Sarah attempted to stack blocks taller than herself, while Tim carefully rebuilt the tower every time it collapsed. Olivia called through video chat from California to say goodnight to her new brother and sister. James sat on the couch watching them. His phone buzzed with messages from the office. Meetings, contracts, business decisions waiting for his attention. But for the first time in a long time, he ignored the phone. He watched Tim carefully steady the block tower, while Sarah tried again to knock it down. Tim looked up proudly. "Dad, look." Sarah almost knocked it over. "But I saved it." James smiled. A real smile. The kind that starts somewhere deep and spreads naturally across your face. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "You saved it." And in that moment James realized something. That freezing night in the park hadn't just saved 2 children. It had saved something inside him, too. His home was no longer silent. His life was no longer empty. And the definition of success had changed forever. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts. What would you have done if you were walking through that park and saw 2 children freezing on a bench? Leave your comment below. And if stories like this remind you that kindness can still change lives, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next story.